Hello, everybody. Well, if you watched the video I did before this, you knew I was going to be joined by Kate from Generate Magic today for a uh, open-ended discussion, Kate, um, about all things manifesting that are both conventional and unconventional. Um, so yeah, we're going to jump right into it. Kate has a website and a YouTube channel. Um, your website, Kate, is generatemagicom, or is it
Exactly.
generatemagicom? And we'll put that link and the link to Kate's YouTube channel below. I've known Kate for a while, and she has very similar sensibilities to me when it comes to both manifesting ideas, being out of the box with them, and also just kind of like the creative process. Kate, we'll find out. I'm gonna grill you in a second about your past history, but Kate's a creative, I would say. You would describe yourself more as like having more of an artistic bent towards this stuff than a scientific bent, correct? Am I right in saying that, Kate?
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
yeah. So anyway, the creative process, I went to school for visual and media arts. I was always into writing. Kate's been into writing for a long time as well. I think that kind of shapes our sensibilities when it comes to a lot of these ideas in implementing them. And we're going to go over some ways of implementing them that you've probably never heard talked about on YouTube before, in the way we're going to discuss. So, Kate, do you wanted to share your brief backstory about how you got into this manifesting stuff and ways that you've applied it in your life?
Well, I think a lot of you have probably heard this before, right? That manifesting is not just a magic trick, right? It's something that we're always doing. And but kind of looking back and sort of looking through an analytical lens, I realized there were times in my life where I was very consciously creating experiences and not even realizing it. And if I had to kind of look at the commonalities between these experiences, it was times when I was very open, very receptive. And I told this story before on my own channel, but I think probably one of the most remarkable occurrences was when I was at Burning Man and I was dancing and I was kind of tired. I was because it was a long week. It was like the last night
Yeah,
and
it's burning, man.
yeah. And I was kind of like falling asleep. And there was even like this person in a cow costume next to me. And I was sort of like pretending to dance with him, but really I was just trying to like clutch onto the costume. So, and I actually kind of had this vision of myself like kind of walking into all these rooms and people would be like really excited to see me. And this was very not like my life was at that time. Like if anything, I would go into a room and then immediately kind of go back to the wall and kind of just try and disappear. And definitely not like the life of the party or anything like that. But within just a couple of weeks after I had this vision, there were like a series of synchronicities that if somebody had explained them to me, I would have said, no way, that's impossible. But it kind of introduced me to this whole underground dance scene. And within a few weeks, it was like I that all those scene or that scene was basically kind of coming into my reality. And looking back on it, that's when I kind of realized just kind of the power of the imagination. And for me specifically, like the dance, like dance really kind of helps, and doing creative things like dance and like writing really kind of helps to facilitate my imagination.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm hearing too, like, a lot, because I remember hearing that story from you before, and like, it's something about movement and like,
Mm.
obviously when you dance, your mind is in a different place than it normally is, at least for most of us. And also, like, when you write, if you like writing, like, your mind kind of goes to a different place. Do you, so for you, in terms of like finding out about the popular ideas that we talk about, like, something that always interests me about your approach is like me, like you're into a lot of different teachers, and think about them in like a non-conservative way. But like I'm curious about like you have a you link A Course in Miracles with psycho-cybernetics very well, and we'll get into this with some of the the points you wanted to touch upon. But I'm curious about like um like when did you find, I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about like what you were doing career, because I know you've done like a lot of copywriting and stuff like that, like career wise, and then like when you found um like A Course in Miracles, and what's the timeline with that, and then we'll get into the psycho-cybernetic stuff later, I'm sure. But
I know it's hard to even kind of construct like a linear
yeah,
timeline. I mean, I've long for a long time I've been into, I guess the first entryway into it was more kind of along the lines of like old school self-help,
right,
like Ian Tracy and people like that. And I think I mean, there's actually kind of a lot of commonalities. I don't think they're necessarily
totally.
completely
That's something
separate
else.
entities.
Yeah, we both agree upon that. Yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, like you studied a little bit of copywriting like, and you look at all the great self-help literature. I think there's more commonalities than people want to admit. You know what I
Oh,
mean? Like,
absolutely.
like I did a podcast episode a while back about like Dale Carnegie and his great book, How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, and
Mhm.
he's quoting James Allen and some other people in there, and you're just like, this is like the same thing as the law of attraction, like in
Oh,
so many
totally.
ways.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it all kind of comes down to just having that clarity of vision and also kind of having like cultivating the right mindset as well.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Um, so do you let's start going over these points. I have them on my computer. Feel free to pull them up. Um, you're in the process of, I know we were talking about, you're in the process of writing a novel, right? And
Yeah.
these are some of this the well, do you want to talk briefly about that, and like how that, like that creative process like has brought out some interesting observations for you in regards to this manifesting stuff and perception stuff?
For sure. Like, I think a lot of people have heard of this whole idea of playing the role of the observer.
Mhm.
And so anytime you find yourself kind of getting reactive to something that's happening, kind of viewing it from a more detached standpoint. And I think narratives provide the perfect lens to do that. And a lot of people, like I know that Vadim Zealand of reality transurfing, he uses this analogy a lot of, it's just like different frames in a movie reel. And the more you can kind of view everything with this level of detachment, the less you become identified with it. And it starts to kind of take on a more empowering approach where you're like, okay, it's not all random and chaotic. It's all leading somewhere. And I don't want to use the word control necessarily, but it at least kind of gives you some sense that you're not just at the whim of some, chaotic random universe, right? That there's something more kind of purposeful and coherent to your experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I also like I really dislike that word control. Just
Mhm.
because of so much stuff. But it has its usage. I mean, like I think words probably like direction, like directing, or
Yeah.
it like are, I don't know. They feel more right. But like I always like to say like Coué always he was always said like you control your imagination, you control yourself. So it's interesting that um a lot of these teachers they basically they say that like you really do have in the very least like a huge um amount of direction that you can give your life that most people are just totally unaware of. And uh detachment is certainly a really good way to do it. What are some of the ways that you have found are effective for detaching? Because as most people in this watching this know, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing
Mhm.
to do it, especially like consistently have it be successful. Do you have any tools or approaches that have helped you do it?
Well, I think, Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely kind of in the camp, right, where I hear a lot of things and I think, oh, that sounds really nice, but it's one thing to hear it, and then it's another thing to actually implement it in your life, especially kind of when you're in the heat of the moment. But I think the reason that story and narrative at least kind of helps me to integrate all of these teachings is because there is a certain coherence, when you're reading a story, and so it makes it much easier to remember. And so one of the analogies that I use is you look at any, so for instance, in the novel that I'm working on, there you just kind of like any narrative structure, there's always kind of this series of ups and downs and highs and lows. So she starts out kind of like at a low point, like she feels like she's a loser, like her life isn't really going anywhere, she doesn't have any friends, and then she kind of gets catapulted into this universe, and it's kind of like a modern take on Alice in Wonderland, but it's kind of more of a metaphorical rabbit hole that she goes down, where all of a sudden she has this thriving social life and she meets this man, that seems to kind of take an interest in her, and everything seems to be looking up. But then it's not long before one of the friends kind of ends up betraying her, and then it turns out that this man that she meets is just interested in hooking up, and so that is really like devastating to her. And so then kind of looking at it like in our own lives, like our own lives, whether or not we're actively manifesting something, like most of us kind of have certain desires, right? Or certain goals. And so our own lives kind of follow the same trajectory, right? Of like highs and lows. And like, let's say you have a date and you're really excited about the date, but then the person ends up being a real jerk, or, you get a new job and then the job is just like a disaster. And but when in real life, the difference I think is that we tend to get very wrapped up in it, and it literally kind of feels like this is the end kind of. Especially like if anybody's ever been, lost a job or been through a breakup, like it can feel really devastating. It can literally kind of feel like your life is over.
Yeah,
And
trauma, serious trauma.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. But like when you're reading it in a story, you can kind of say, okay, well, I'm on page 50 right now, and there's 300 pages in the book. So I know this is not the end of the story. Or if it's like if it's a TV series that you're watching, you can say, well, the main character just got shot, but because the name of the main character, his name is in the title of the series, somehow I doubt he's really dead.
right,
And so it kind of it kind of gets you to sort of step outside a little bit and kind of view it. Yes, you can get like engaged, right? And we do like cry, during movies, or when we get really wrapped up in a book, but at the same time we know that at the end of the day, like, we're not that character,
right.
and we know that the story is not actually over yet. We know there's going to be more twists and turns, and I think if there's one thing we can kind of rely on in this life, right, it's change. And
Yeah,
even,
y-
even death is not really the end, right?
right. Or maybe it is. But
Well, the
yeah,
way I look at it is like, even let's just kind of say worst case scenario, you just turn into dust or whatever, then you wouldn't really be able to grieve it. So
right, right. I find that comforting.
yeah.
Most people probably watches don't, but I do. Um, but yeah, I mean, that's those are such good points, and it really is interesting, like looking at things through like a narrative lens, because that like our thinking is basically a narrative lens.
Mhm.
Like you can't help but put a past and future to things usually, and the irony of, I mean, I know both of us are really into like just being present, like in the moment or whatever. And like, if when you do that, if you really do that, like I guess you aren't thinking about a past and future, right? Like if you're really present, like, but generally speaking, like past and future are like what's being projected from our mind, and I've had, a lot of similar experiences. And it's interesting, you talk about um like, well, one thing I want to point out is like The up and down thing, again, that's pretty much universal. There might be some
Exactly.
weird exceptions, but like, um, what did Lester Levinson say? He said, get off the roller coaster, because
Mhm.
it's like, but like the life's a roller coaster in many ways. And there are, if there's highs, there's going to be lows. It's like
Mhm.
almost like an inherent thing. And withdrawing ourselves some, if we can, in whatever way we can, uh, helps obviously deal with it. And the idea, I think a lot of the time, like I think what Lester meant when he said get off the roller coaster is like transcend it.
Mhm.
It's like you're
Yeah.
like there's
Seeing the
not
bigger
good,
picture.
right, see the bigger picture, and then like it's not like there's not going to be people suffering, and it's
Mhm.
not like you aren't going to feel physical pain ever or something like that, but you rise above it in a way, and so your life becomes smoother. Now, there's a lot of people in certain communities, like the law of assumption community, which would say, well, no, you just have to, everything can just be perfect. Or other places, people say you shift the timeline, everything's perfect. I mean, I guess so, but like very wise people who I trust more than any of those people who comment on that stuff, they usually make it seem like it's more of a, like you transcend the duality of going up and down, but the up and down is inherent. That's
Yeah.
like, and that's the link, a big link, I think, between um other forms of spirituality and like the law of attraction. It's like there's ups and downs. And I think what the law of attraction does really well is it makes it so that you are hopefully going to have more ups in your life than before, but also you're able, like all these great spiritual teachings, to kind of navigate the lows in a more effective way, like
Absolutely.
having that distance. And yeah, I'm yammering now, but I studied film at school, and I saw one thing I always found very interesting, because I was really into movies, and from like kind of pretty artistic standpoint. So like I loved Hollywood movies, but I loved all kinds of movies, including really experimental movies. But one thing that always stuck with me, I remember watching some films by like Stan Brakhage or Brakich, I think is how you say his name. He's this experimental filmmaker, very famous in
Mhm.
like the 1960s and 70s. And he would have just like, images and, colors and shadows, and you didn't necessarily know what was what. Um, he's got this movie, I think it's called Dog Star Man. And for that genre, super experimental, very famous. And it's interesting. I was watching it and I was like, what's crazy about this movie? And like really any movie, if it's more than just like a couple minutes long, or like any story, because unless it's a poem, but if any story that's even a short story, certain, but like this movie, this experimental movie where it's like mainly just colors and images and da. I was like, this freaking thing has a narrative.
Mhm.
There's a narrative. I was like, this thing is nothing without the narrative. Like
Absolutely.
you can't appreciate it without the narrative of it. And it's like,
Mhm.
wow, like literally everything that like we observe, our thinking minds, like it places a narrative on it. And
Yeah.
it's so helpful to realize that, because then you don't feel
Exactly.
as trapped by
Yeah.
the narrative per se. Well, it's like, this is a narrative, like,
Mhm.
and that links to, I mean, well, I get just to throw some psycho-cybernetics in right now. I mean, Maltz always talks about like seeing yourself on the movie screen and then like
Mhm.
getting into um the movie, I guess. But like the point is like similar to what uh you know Vadim says in reality transurfing. It's like it's a film, and like it's images one after another, but you also have the ability to, if it's negative, to step back and be like, well, this is happening now, but I don't necessarily have to see it in the way I'm seeing it if I'm really stressed or suffering about it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I there's in reality transurfing, I think I see myself, I see my reality. That's kind of one of the ways that you can kind of wake yourself up when you're just kind of going along with the script and becoming really like identify, kind of help you decide, okay, do I want to continue down this trajectory?
Right.
And again, it's not necessarily about externally changing or externally controlling what's happening, but at least kind of choosing how you respond and also what meaning you choose to make out of everything that's happening.
Totally. Yeah. I think it's often much more about our reactivity,
Hmm.
and like that again ties right in, like I was into Buddhism. I'm still a little bit into Buddhism, but I was really into Buddhism when I was younger. And like, obviously they talk all about mindfulness, and that's about a lot about dealing with reactivity. But then like, when I got a little bit older and like, I was in my late 20s and I was working in real estate. So talking to a lot of people, and I learned more about communication. Um, I realized, I was studied more self-improvement, dealing directly with reactivity and how we react to like what someone says. And like, that's so much of all this stuff is that reactive component. Like, what's our natural response? And then like, if we see ourselves responding in a way we don't want, can we at least withdraw so we don't have as much of a charge from the response? And that ties, like the 7-day mental diet. Emmett Fox talks about like, if like the hot coal or ember from a fire gets on your shirt, if you knock it off right away, your shirt's not going to have a hole in it. But if you don't knock it off right away, you're going to have a big hole in your shirt from the coal or the ember. And that's so much of this practice. It's like being able to like, it's not that the negative thought or negative response isn't there, but like Emmett Fox says, you don't dwell in it. You choose not to dwell in it. You have a high level of control, if not maybe total control, but in the very least, a high level of control over what you choose to dwell in terms of, what you're responding to and reacting to.
Absolutely. And recently there was something that happened with one of my copywriting clients where they said something to me that really shook me. And I interpreted as they're cutting my workload in half. And it was already kind of slow to begin with. And so I went into full on panic mode and fear and desperation. But then as I kind of started to course correct and get myself into a more sort of like empowering mindset and being like, no, it's all good. Everything's working exactly the way it's supposed to. They actually sent me a follow-up email. It was somebody else from the company sent a follow-up email and said that the last email was a misunderstanding. And that somebody, another coworker had kind of misunderstood what he said and gave me the wrong message, and that wasn't the case.
Right.
And then I had another instance where I I kind of had another opportunity. I mean, something came up and I had an opportunity to react in the same way. And I was like, no, that's just a misunderstanding. And sure enough, I get an email the next day saying that exact same thing. No, it's just a misunderstanding. So
Yeah. Instant revision,
funny the
right?
way this stuff works.
It is. It's crazy. And the thing is like, then you get used to it, not in like in like a great way, you know what I mean? But it's amazing. And that, um, yeah. I mean, I almost think of like A Course in Miracles about like just forgiving and letting go in that moment too. Like, um, yeah. It, so yeah, do you have the list in front of you? I just closed my second computer. I can open it up again if you want, but um, let's see what the next point we want to cover is. If you have, oh, here we go. Um,
Oh, I just wanted to add one more thing
of
about
course, yeah,
misunderstandings. That's one of the key conflicts in relationships comes down to misunderstandings. And I don't know how many times
exactly.
somebody says something and then somebody else or does something and somebody else kind of interprets it through their own lens and it ends up being a big issue when all along it was just a misunderstanding. And so
Yeah,
I think that's another kind of instance where it's good to kind of just check in with yourself and even you don't even necessarily, I mean, sometimes it just as a case by case basis. Sometimes I'll assign it like a different story, but sometimes I'll even say this, maybe this doesn't mean what I think it means. Just kind of opening up that possibility.
yeah, it's a great point.
And I
Absolutely.
think
Like,
in Course in Miracles, that's one of the main teachings too, is just kind of saying like, can I see this in a different way? Or can I see love instead of this?
right. Yeah. And that's huge. I mean, we're underplaying it. I mean, in interpersonal relationships, having the capability to do that, and again, you can practice this and get better at it for sure, is huge. Like, if you cannot fly right off the handle, especially if it's like a loved one, like, or whatever, like, but instead just wait and basically be like, can I see another way of looking at this? Or can I just recognize that I love this person and it's probably just a misunderstanding, or it could be a misunderstanding. Maybe it's not. Can I sleep on it before I, engage with them on it? I mean, I found in my own life, that's like just a huge, it really makes things smoother in, inner dynamics in relationships we care about, whether they be like at work or within families, or that's one thing like. Yeah, that's like like a subtle law of attraction. I mean, Course in Miracles type thing that really um, has helped me a lot. And it definitely has like something I've done a lot more of when I became aware of it through these kind of, law of attraction ideas.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we have here, the the hero's trajectory, with both experiencing the hero's trajectory, this narrative of the hero, with both interest and detachment. See how the ups and downs are stepping stones leading to the ultimate fulfillment of the hero's mission and connect to the larger theme. Similar to the unfolding or bridge we hear about in manifestation lingo, bridge of incidents, etc.
Mm.
Yeah, do you want to expand upon some of that? Because that's great. That's a great point.
Yeah, and so I think this even kind of like takes it up a notch, where again, you can kind of see something that seems like it's a disaster, and you can say not only is this going to change for the better, but this is actually working out exactly the way it's supposed to, and whatever has just happened is actually leading me to everything that I want.
Yes, love that. Yeah, turning the disadvantage into an advantage.
Yes. And in my the story that I'm writing, the main character, she just kind of has this series of really humiliating, sort of degrading experiences, and all of this becomes the catalyst to really kind of launch her into this new reality where she's like, no, this is who I am now.
Yeah. And again, it's like we were saying earlier, like it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to experience it,
Mhm,
because this is like this is the work, I think, when it
mhm,
comes to this stuff, is like when you feel embarrassed, shamed, humiliated, or like, I did the video the other day about like, grief, like you feel grief or you feel sorrow or fear, working through that is like, that's no joke. I mean, there's no formula. Like that's like, you got to do whatever you can to process that. But if, like you're saying, if you're able to recognize that you're processing it and
mhm.
distance yourself in some way, it does become more doable. And you also, once you've processed it, the same stuff doesn't happen in the same way again. You know what I mean? Or
Exactly.
in the very least, it's minimized to a great degree. It's like
Mhm,
once you've learned something, or truly processed it, you're transformed, and you're a different person. And the incidents that used to bother you don't bother you as much. So
mhm,
yeah, that's such a great, concept, that like when like something bad happens, seemingly, it can be exactly what's needed to, spring you forward to exactly what you want. Um, but again, like we hear the popularized version is like, the sanitized version on YouTube and Reddit and stuff like that. That's like, something bad happens and you just spring forward. It's like, no, when the bad thing happens, it fucking sucks. Like it's like it's
mhm,
very like it hurts usually, even if you're aware of what's going on, very aware of what's going on, and working on feeling through it, as well as just thinking through it. um it still is going to be painful, and at
mhm.
least in all likelihood, most of the
For
time.
sure.
But the point is, you'll process and get through it, and you will be a different person, um
Mhm.
on the other end, and you will demonstrate, that the new person that you are, as opposed to the old person, the old man, as Neville would say. Yeah.
Exactly. I think tapping can be really good for processing certain like
Yeah.
difficult emotions or painful experiences, because it always kind of starts by acknowledging whatever it is that you're experiencing and saying, I love and accept myself anyway, and then working working to the opposite of that. So if it's discouragement that you're feeling, working towards kind of feeling more, optimism. But it's not just like you're immediately going into the optimism. Instead, it's kind of more of a gradual transition that I think kind of feels more realistic in a certain
Yes,
way.
definitely.
And sometimes if you just kind of immediately try and force yourself to go to the other end, sometimes it can even be like a lot of resistance.
Totally. Way like usually way too much. And even if you
Yeah,
somehow get there, it's hard to replicate usually. Like so
exactly.
we were talking, I might have been the group call last week or what have you, but if you can get down from like if you're at like a zero is no stress and 10's high stress. If you're at like a 9 or 10, if you can get down to like a 5 or 6 relatively quickly, that is a massive improvement. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like that should be seen as a victory. And then when you're at that 5 or 6, it's much easier to then get down to a 0 or a 1 or a 2. But trying to consistently, like, I don't know, smash the stress or suppress it, it works sometimes really well. And like when I like all the movement and stuff I talk about, like the radical movement, or dancing or something like that can get it down
For
relatively
sure.
quickly. But I found, as much as I love that stuff, that like I need to do other stuff to like feel stabilized usually, as opposed to just like screaming and running around. It
Mhm.
like, at least in like how I live, the lifestyle I have, like um and like tap. I feel like I should talk about tapping more. I don't utilize it that much personally, but like so many people love it, and like I've done it before, and it's exactly like you say, like it you know it stabilizes you. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And it's a great mind body tool, because you're using your mind and you're using your body, and at the same time. So yeah, a lot of people have a really solid physiological response from doing that. Um, yeah, do you want to move on? We can move on to the next point, which is tied together with that, which is, um, and this ties into like what Neville says, what like the writer, there's the producer, director, writer, and actor, or
Oh,
something
yes.
like that. And here this point is just like the writer director perspective. Take it up a notch, because now not only are you perceiving the bridge, but you're actively constructing the bridge.
Mhm.
Do you want to comment on that at all in terms of like ways to better do that? I mean, obviously through awareness, but how do people like something that like I have trouble like um, conveying to clients, like to get them confident about, is what we just said. It's like something really crappy has happened,
Mhm.
and like understandably they're like, this is crappy, but it's hard to convey like it's gonna be okay. You know what I mean? Like this is actually a good thing. Like you need this to happen in order for the next good thing to happen. Um, I think that's something that like people just have to experience for themselves and process. But do you have
Mhm.
any additional thoughts about like how they can better do that? Because it's scary, like.
Oh, definitely. Let me see. I'm just looking at my notes to see if there's anything that I added to that. But one thing I can kind of think of, sort of right off the bat, is how there's that saying, hindsight is 2020,
Right.
and sometimes it's easier to kind of look back and analyze things that have already happened. And so I can come up with tons of examples from my past of things that I thought were just a disaster or a complete failure. And I can trace a very clear line to how it led exactly where I needed to go. And so that kind of helps to reassure you that that maybe I can't necessarily see all the parts, but it at least kind of helps to build that trust that this is not the end of the world, and this is in fact, everything is kind of working out exactly the way it should be. So I find like sometimes that can be really helpful.
Totally. Definitely. And I mean, that helps you build faith. And once you get into this stuff for a while, you can cite more examples of it happening. And
Exactly.
even before, like, if you think about it, seriously, you can think about so many other aspects in your life where, you thought it was a
Mhm.
disaster and it ended up being the best thing that could have happened, right?
Yes, exactly.
but we still forget this all the time, or at least I do. You know what I mean? Like bad stuff happens, seemingly bad stuff, and you're like, how am
Oh,
I
I
going to get out
forget
of it?
too.
Yeah, I think everybody does. I mean, again, that's the practice.
Yes.
This is the stuff that people don't want to discuss a lot of the time, because it's like that's how it is. It's like it'd
Mhm.
be wonderful if we didn't forget as much, but um this is like faith, or like, you know what, like talking about faith, and like people are like, well, how do you build faith? And it's like, well, there's many different ways I guess you could do it, but one way is to realize what you've already done
Exactly.
and gone through.
Mhm.
And when you quote unquote didn't know as much a lot of the time, right? It's like, well, like when I didn't know about these principles or these ideas, or just to have as much of life experience as I now have by any means, I still got through this and it actually worked out pretty well, right? So
Yeah.
like if I could do that then, you know, I can continue to do it hopefully. And like I think you and I would both say it's also like God or the universe or whatever is like taking care of you. You know what I mean? Like when you
Yeah.
surrender to like it will be taken care of,
Mhm.
like, you know, how can I see love, light, God in this moment, which is always there, right?
Mhm.
Like it's, I don't know, that's reassurance, you know, like in and of itself. But even if you have that, I feel like most of us have to remind ourselves every day, make it a practice to remind ourselves it's gonna
Absolutely.
be okay. Yeah.
Yeah, like I can kind of think a lot of times in my past where it seems like from my perspective now, like I was a complete mess. Like I just had a very poor mindset and very much just saw myself as a victim and did not have myself together at all. But yet I still managed to kind of pull everything together relatively quickly. And so I always
Exactly.
kind of tell myself, if I could do it then, I can do it now. And that actually sort of this whole idea kind of ties into something else that I was wanting to talk about, kind of the messy middle. And so this kind of has to do with the whole idea of if you have, and this is something Maxwell Maltz kind of talks about, like, and I mean, he's not the only one that talks about it, but I think he explains it really well. That if you have like a guiding vision, a very clear vision of whatever it is that you want, then that vision will actually kind of help to guide you through whatever it is that you're currently navigating. And so you might not necessarily be able to see all the connective parts, and it may even seem at times like you're failing or you're going in the opposite direction of whatever it is that you want. But in fact, the way he explains it, like all the failures are actually kind of it's kind of hard to explain, but he calls it like the servo mechanism. And so the failures actually kind of help this machine. Think of it as this kind of like divine machine. It kind of helps it to course correct. And it kind of it kind of helps it to more clearly define whatever it is that you want and kind of point you in the right direction. And so yeah, so it's just kind of keeping your eye on the vision. And so I think it's sort of balancing like clarity with trust and sort of being able to let go of control a little bit, which for me is very difficult. But just kind of saying, okay, I don't know exactly what's going to happen on the next page, kind of using the book analogy, but I at least know that it's all going to work out in the end, in the grand scheme of things. And that also kind of, and when you're writing, there's something that writers can probably relate to when you're in the middle of a story. And so a lot of us call it the messy middle. Because when you first get started on a story, it's usually very exciting, it feels very fresh. And then when you get towards the middle, you're like, I'm not exactly sure, where this is going.
Right.
And you might even start to kind of lose confidence and be like, this is terrible. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
but if you keep sort of that overarching vision, that the theme, kind of the main theme of your story, then that will kind of help to guide it along, and that will kind of help, yeah, to help kind of give it more clarity. And so I think whether, yeah, the middle you're thinking about in a very literal terms, in terms of the middle of a book, or you're kind of thinking about it in what they refer to as the messy middle in manifestation lingo, I think the analogy kind of still applies.
For sure. I mean, that's some of my favorite, like, manifesting law of attraction advice. You know, the other funny thing is like a lot of people wouldn't even consider Psycho-Cybernetics a law of attraction book. We both do, but yeah, for those of you who have never read Psycho-Cybernetics, it's well worth reading, and that's one of the better one of the, I mean, there's so many amazing points in that book, but this idea that you fail your way to success and that you have this servo mechanism, or, you know, your wonderful human imagination or God or whatever term you want to use, that's guiding you as you, so the failure is just getting you closer and closer to what you want if you have that vision. Um, that's some of my favorite advice, especially for people who are coming from Neville, where it's like where they're very scared a lot of the time that like they have this vision, and if
Mhm.
they don't keep to the vision, it's not going to happen. And Maltz is like, no, you're messing up all the time. That's how you get there. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and there's that. I put this in the Law of Attraction Simplified, that quote from Beyond Positive Thinking, where he says, I'm blanking on the author's name. Who's the author of Beyond Positive Thinking? It will come to me. But you know, he gives the plane analogy, how planes back in the day, and maybe still do, they get from New York to London and they're off target 90% of the time, but they
Mhm.
always get to the airport in New York to the airport in London. Robert Anthony, that's, I believe,
Mm.
the Beyond Positive Thinking guy. But that's a lot like, you know, what Maltz is talking about. So this idea of being okay failing yourself to success, and, you know, imaginally having faith and just thinking, well, this is going to happen even though all this stuff's happening, you know, my mind and body is just recalibrating like it needs to do to get me there. It's so empowering.
Mhm.
I think of that. I think E.L. Doctorow has that line, like writing a book is like, you know, driving with the head, like you're on like a mountain pass or something and you're driving and you can see as far as the headlights go and it's a stormy night. And, you know, you can drive like that and get all the way home. Do you know what
That's
I
the
mean?
perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And as a writer myself, you know, when I write my books, invariably there comes a time where I'm like, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing, or like, this is crap. This
Exactly.
is, but the thing is, especially once you've done it a few times,
Mhm.
like you just are like, this is just part of the process. Like you just know. It's very interesting. Like, you know, the last few things I've written that have been longer, like it comes up and I'm just like, whatever. Like this is part of the process. Like, you know, this self, and like, you know, maybe, you know, it's like, oh, maybe this does suck. Or like, maybe I'm like off target here. Maybe, you know, and like, I think if I'm way off target, I'll notice. But even if it sucks, whatever, I'm doing it. I can always step back and change it later or not publish it or whatever. But that never happens because it's like,
Mhm.
the mistakes I see, I recalibrate. So you just recalibrate. Not about being perfect. It's about just doing the best you can and having that clear vision, and you know, and the whatever faith you can muster that it's going to happen.
Yeah, and I think when you're learning a new skill, whether it's a new sport or a language or a musical instrument, I think you almost kind of expect this to be part of the process. Like, or at least when you have those kind of missteps in the beginning, you don't freak out. You're like,
It's a
yeah, this
great
is
point.
natural. I'm new, I'm learning. And this is all sort of an opportunity to perfect my craft and to improve. But I think when it's kind of applied to other scenarios, like relationship scenarios or financial scenarios, it can, we kind of come at it from a different perspective, even though it's really the same thing. And all of a sudden, it's the failures we see as like, or the missteps we kind of see as, oh no, this is a sign it's never going to work out.
Right. Exactly. And that's like, for manifesting stuff, that's how people see it too. And it's like, and you know, it's crazy.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think just kind of in our conventional culture, there's sort of like a common narrative with people that have achieved great things. And so, for instance, J.K. Rowling, like when she, like Harry Potter was rejected like hundreds of times before it was accepted, or Michael Jordan being rejected from his high school basketball team.
Right.
And so we hear these stories, a lot of really, really great people. And this whole idea of, yeah, just, and I think the message behind it is basically just persist, like don't give up. But then we come into this whole idea of like manifestation and instant manifestation.
Right.
And all of a sudden we kind of come at it from a different viewpoint. And we start, yeah, if we don't instantly see the success we want, and I'm definitely been guilty of this too, I immediately, start thinking, oh no, I'm doing something wrong. And then that kind of actually kind of recreates the experience where you think you're constantly doing something wrong.
Yep. Yeah,
And or
it's
it can just kind of result in you constantly, and again, I'm speaking for myself as well, just kind of constantly trying like, oh, maybe I'll try a different technique or maybe I'll change the wording, in my affirmations and then
right. Then it will work.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like this quick fix magic stuff is
Mhm.
not, that's not how you generate magic, at least
Yeah.
most of the time. It's not, yeah, the failure thing is essential.
Yes.
Embrace the quote unquote failure, embrace the messy middle,
Mhm.
and if you don't, if you're not willing to, in regards to like manifesting like a specific thing, whether it be like a relationship or more money
Mhm.
or something like that, if you're not willing to embrace the messy middle to get that thing you think you really want, I would reconsider whether you really want that thing, at least most of the
Mhm.
time. Like it's like there's a lot of, we had that question a couple of weeks ago I answered from someone who wrote in, being like, I'm scared to love. I'm scared to be in a relationship because the person's, they're going to die basically eventually. And, I'm going to, and, I, a large part of my answer to that question was like, yeah, I see that. Like, you know what I mean? If you don't like, and it's like, you can do all this work to come to peace with that. Obviously, that's the more like conventional approach, and it's a great approach. But also, you can consider, well, maybe I don't want to be, maybe I want to be alone then, or maybe I
Mhm.
want, or, and that's the kind of thing that like, I mean, that's not conventional advice, but that's like, you got to be honest with yourself.
Exactly.
People, especially when it comes to manifesting, people say all these things that they quote unquote want, right, or really desire, and they don't really want them.
Mhm.
I mean, it's like that's what, I know you liked my new book, Money Your Friend, like what where I'm talking about like, have a statement of something you really want, right? But then think about what's the underlying thing, like the value, whether it's like
Mhm.
peace or love or whatever that you really want. And like I can tell you, like if you have a statement that you write again and again and it feels true most of the time, or that's something you probably really want. But a
Mhm.
lot of the time, if we look deeper, the things we say we want are just masking what we really want, which whether it be love or like a feeling of wealth or a feeling of security. So that's what you really want. You know what I'm saying? It's not
Mhm.
like the specific, six-figure job or that specific person, it's like, like a lot of people that have SP issues, like I tell them, like, it's great if you're in a relationship. It's also great if you're not in a relationship. You know what I mean? If you can want
Exactly.
a relationship, a good, healthy relationship, and not be this desperate person about it, because that's not what you want.
Mhm.
What you want is that love and that feeling of, whatever, like that feeling of love, and um being desperate to fulfill that, just that's a shitty that the messy middle is very messy then. you know
Yes, and
and,
I mean, I can kind of speak because I'm at a place now where I feel very secure when it comes to relationships, but there was a point in my life where I was not secure. So I can definitely sort of empathize with a lot of that desperation. And I think I think a large part of what it is, like, like you say, you want love, but really where it comes from is it comes from like a fear of being alone. And so
yeah,
that I think for me was sort of the driving mechanism. And I was in this relationship for years where I was just really miserable. And it was like an uphill battle just trying to get it to work. And I think at a certain point, like somebody, asked me, like, why, if you're so unhappy, why are you still trying so hard? And I never really even asked myself that. It was just like, oh, I like this kind of iron grip, like I have to have this. And I have to make this work. And when I really thought about it, it was like, no, it was coming from a place of fear.
yeah, yeah. And it takes just, a lot of times people aren't aware of that till they're aware of it, you
Mhm.
know
For sure.
yeah, yeah.
And by the way, I really enjoyed your book, Money Your Friends.
Yes,
And yeah,
yeah,
just kind
thank
of doing
you.
the exercises. And yeah, just kind of noticing like the common themes that come up. And for me lately, almost every single time, it always comes back to freedom. I think
Yeah.
is kind of the underlying thing.
Mhm. I think
Like for
for
instance, I'll write things like I am free to live wherever I want, to spend my days doing whatever I want. And so I think freedom is kind of always the underlying thing. And then kind of thinking about, well, okay, there's some things where, living wherever you want, there's some things where money might be required, but as far as being able to spend your days, how you want, there's a lot more flexibility.
Yeah. A lot more openness,
Exactly. Yes.
yeah, yeah. A large part of that exercise is just allowing for that openness and flexibility, because
Mhm.
I think for the majority of people, the ideal underlying the statements might change every day for what people say they want that day, but the underlying I call it high ideal in the
Mhm.
book, is probably for most people going to stay pretty much the same. I mean, like, there's other words for freedom, like, you could
Mhm.
say peace or
Yeah.
I don't know, serenity, but like it's the same. It helps us identify what we really want, for
Mhm.
instance, freedom. And then like you start to feel more expansive about it, I guess you could say. It just seems part more of your everyday life and more doable, more reachable in the, external 3D world or whatever. So yeah.
Exactly. Whereas I think if you try and start from the other end, because a lot of not not really manifestation teachings necessarily, or at least mainstream, but a lot of spiritual teachings kind of talk about letting go of your desires and just kind of getting into all this more spiritual stuff. But sometimes I think it can be very difficult to get there, because it's almost kind of like you have these desires but you're trying to deny that you have the
Yeah.
desires. And so I like the approach of your book, because it kind of starts from the opposite end of, it starts with the desires and then kind of seeing how it can lead to a more expansive place.
Well, that's just from experience going, because
Yeah.
I was into the other type of spirituality, if we're going to put them in two camps before. And again, both camps have tremendous value, and
Mhm.
but for me, one reason the law of attraction is so valuable is because it allows you to be okay with your desires, like,
Yeah, like I think the desires, they can almost be kind of like a gateway.
yes, exactly. And it's like it's kind of like representative of who you are in your deepest
Mhm.
core, and which are all good things. You know what I mean? Like
Exactly.
the things you value most. But so many religions, like, and so many spiritual teachings are like, well, you have to renounce everything to
Mhm.
get what you want, and that makes no sense a lot of the time. It's on a practical level, it doesn't, at least in Western
Yes.
culture, from what I've seen. I mean, I lived at a Zen center, and like I love the people there, and I learned a ton. But like for practical living, like all the Zen stuff I was into for years, like has not served me nearly as much as the law of attraction information I've found over the years, and I think a big reason is for what just said, yeah, being okay with what you really want, and knowing
Mhm.
it's not bad to really want something,
For
it's
sure.
it's great how these type of manifesting teachings, they say your desire is like, God speaking to you. It's like, oh,
Mhm.
I don't have to
Yeah,
feel bad about, wanting a relationship or wanting money. There's nothing wrong
exactly.
with that, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, it's when we misdirect that or deny it, that's when it gets dicey. But
Mhm.
just don't do that, right? That's the self work. So yeah, I think I know we have to wrap up soon. There's several other points here that tie in. I would love for us to hop back on a call sometime soon and just discuss them a little bit more. We covered the main ones for sure, but I always love talking to you, and I love to talk a little bit more about malts and psychocybernetics,
For
because I
sure.
don't know, it's such like a obvious one for the manifesting community to like start utilizing more, and like there's just not enough people talking about it that then integrate the more of course in miracles like you do, which is very unique with integrating malts, but like just like Neville and malts is a great combination. I don't know, I just think it's the kind of thing that I'd love to have more people talking about, so we'll have to talk more about that soon if you want.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And yeah, this was great. And Kate can be found at generatemagic.com and at her YouTube channel. I'll put the link to both of those below. Any parting words of wisdom for our audience?
I don't know necessarily about words of wisdom, but basically just to kind of recap what we were talking about earlier. This so yeah, I think kind of tying in playing the role of the observer into narrative. So yeah, I think the more you can kind of see your life as a movie or see your life as a book, And whether you're viewing it from the viewpoint of the reader or the person watching the movie, or whether you're viewing it from the viewpoint of the writer or the director, I think all of it will kind of allow you to simultaneously still be like engaged in the experience and kind of recognizing, this is what we came for, is to have this human experience and to embrace all of the emotions. And but at the same time to kind of see it from a more detached standpoint and just to kind of feel comforted knowing that it's all leading somewhere.
Yeah, it's great practical advice for sure. Well, thank you again. And we'll stay on a chat for a couple of minutes. But yeah, thank you everybody for watching, and feel free to reach out to Kate with any questions. We'll see you next time. Bye.